everyone, and welcome to the 2022 One Sustainability Conference, our annual Global Sustainability Conference. We now have the pleasure of welcoming Anders Rodenberg, the CEO of Denominator at One Sustainability. Anders will tell us more about bringing the social aspects to the core of sustainable investing. Anders, thank you. Thank you for joining us today from Colombia. So we look forward to your presentation here this morning at the conference. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's such an important topic and something that I find very dear. Sustainable investment is at the core of many things in this world right now and can really move the needle. We know if we can get the money to flow in the right directions, then we can really start to see big progress. So for today, I'll just see if I can make the slides move further, and I can. So yeah, I'm the CEO of Denominator. I won't talk too much about Denominator, but we work with diversity, equity, and inclusion ratings and scores. I think more importantly, maybe you can tell I have a bit of an accent, so I'm originally from Denmark and Sweden, but yeah, currently in Colombia, live in New York. But I've always worked with data my entire life, at least the adult life. From many different types of investment and using data to understand knowledge and to gain insights. So, but today I'm really excited about the topic because it almost fits very well with my own professional career development and how I've sort of evolved with data throughout the different types of risk and investing. And this is what brings us to the topic of today, which is, of course, bringing the social aspect into the core of sustainable investment. In order to do that, I think we'll run through a few different things. But first, we will have a bit of a look at the evolution of risk and the ESG spaghetti ball. Then we'll look at the human capital DI investment paradox. We'll look at some of the social data challenges and solutions, and then we can have a look at some of the investment use case examples in the end. But I think here, starting off, when we talk about sustainable investment, I think currently in the debates, there is a lot of I wouldn't say misunderstanding, but there are two different approaches. There is impact investment, and then there is risk. So just to set the scene, I'll be focusing more traditionally on investment from a risk perspective and not necessarily the impact. The good news, however, is within the social aspect of sustainable investment, the risk and the impact are actually more aligned than in some of the other areas. So if you do one well, you actually also have an impact. But just wanted to set that out there because many people are sort of in the industry right now talking about impact versus risk, and the others I'll be focusing more on the traditional risk. So, but if we talk about the concept of risk, I think it is important to set the scene by looking at how that has evolved. Again, we go back 15 years and said risk. Everyone was thinking from an investment perspective, financial risk. We would look at the credit risk ratings, we would look at the financial performance, and that was risk. Over the last couple of years, we've then introduced a lot of additional risk areas, such as tax and transfer pricing. We have a lot of regulatory risk like anti-money laundering, sanctions, and other type of regulatory risk. And lately also cyber risk. And how that can really affect the investment in companies, or at least the profits or the gains from certain investment over others. And then finally here now we're in sort of the ESG risk or sustainable risk area. That is of course very crucial to understand in order to do sustainable investment. But this is where I think we do need to take a quick stop and say, you know, ESG or sustainable investment, we need to really look at what's in there in order to be able to do put social and that piece of the investment at the core, because sustainability at the end of the day looks at the planet and people. So it's a two-component thing. And again, ESG is also a multiple component thing. So if we look at ESG, it's both the environmental, it's the social and governance, but even environmental, it's carbon emissions, it's water, it's biodiversity. That also contains multiple sub-elements. Same with governance, it's rules, how we assess things, the procedures we have, and so forth. And social, which we'll be focusing more on today, also have different sub-elements like human rights, consumer protection, health and safety. But the big one is, of course, diversity, equity, inclusion, and human capital, and the people of the sustainability piece. But the reason I think that this is important to actually highlight is that many are treating ESG as one thing, but as we can just see, it is many things. But because this is a problem when we're looking at today's ESG ratings, effectively many of them are E-ratings because they are almost 90, 95, and 98% E-focused, E-driven. The methodologies are based on E-data. And again, so this is sort of almost skewing things into that bucket versus sort of a general ESG or general sustainable investment perspective. The issue by treating these things in a combined thing is really that it's combining two things that don't necessarily correlate very well, like environmental and social risks. Those are two separate type of risks. So by grouping them together, you can start to have some confusion in this, which I think we have seen in the sustainable investment community. So a good example, I think, is also tax and cyber risk. They are not grouped together. We don't talk about TC ratings because it wouldn't necessarily make sense. Something that has a high tax risk doesn't have to have a high cyber risk and vice versa. So the point is really it's the same for the E and the S. Last year I was invited to Glasgow at the COP26 to talk about the correlation between the E and the S. So again, if we were to use it as one type of risk only, they would need to have a very high correlation. And the fact is that they don't. Because if we look here, we at COP, we looked at renewable energy companies and oil and gas companies to see who is performing better or worse on the social aspect from a DI perspective. And the interesting thing is from a total DI, looking at gender, race, ethnicity, age, disability, sexuality, education backgrounds, if people have kids or not, all the sort of things that makes us diverse. The companies that are very good at the E, you could say, and the companies that are less good at the E with the oil and gas, they are performing equally on the social aspect. On the gender aspect, renewable companies, energy companies are better, but from a race ethnicity perspective, the oil and gas companies are performing better. Age, renewable energy, disability, oil and gas. Again, the point of it is that there is no direct correlation here. And it's actually the same. We looked at the race to zero, the large companies that have committed to 1.5. So again, really the companies that are driving the E and ensuring we can try and save the planet. The bad news is that regular companies are actually outperforming these companies that have committed so heavily to the E. So they're, again, I don't have to go through the details here, but the point is there are no specific correlation between them, which is a problem when we're talking from an investment perspective, if we're grouping things together that don't necessarily belong in the same group. So this is why I think this is at least conceptually a way to think about risk and that development that we saw before. So financial, tax, regulatory risk, cyber risk, then environmental. This is where there's been a lot of work. There's a lot of data out there on the carbon, on water, on biodiversity is one of the new ones that is really increasing. So that is all perfect, but this is again where we need to decouple the E and the S in order to manage them and understand the risk and the opportunities that lays within. So for this presentation, again, now we've decoupled it, we will then have a look at the social aspect. And as you saw before, there are also sub-elements there, but there's really one that is at the key, which is people, human capital, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. The reason I think that is the most important is because it is the people aspect of sustainability, so planet and people, but also because when you think about it, it's actually people that are affecting all the other risk areas. So not only do we have principles for responsible investment in February going out and saying all investors should really look at DI in their investment strategies, but we can also see from a lot of the newest research and reports that it's more than 80% of job applicants will not want to consider employers that do not do DI well, do not have DI policies. So again, if we can't attract the right talent, we can't get the good decisions, we can't get the innovation. So that's of course a big risk for companies, and hence the investments that we might make in them if the companies are not performing well on that area. Same with research showing that it's more than 70% of consumers prefer buying from companies that are aligned to their values. And this is where a lot of the new generations coming into the market, having a larger market share right now, they care a lot about DEI. So again, this is where over time, if you don't do it well, the people will stop buying the products of these companies, which is also a big risk. When revenue goes down, it goes straight to the financial risk. But it's even cyber risk, right? 95% of all cyber risks, breaches and security areas is people driven. So again, you need to understand the people in order to actually understand the cyber risk element. And it's the same with tax and finance and others. So at the end of the day, people, human capital, DI is at the core of understanding all types of risk related to investments in general, but especially sustainable investments. And this sort of leads me to the DI investment paradox, as I call it, because as we just talked about and saw, like DI is central to understanding any type of risk. We can even see that like 91% of all the larger financial institutions, so those that work with risks, they themselves have DI policies, they have DI officers, they have many efforts in this area. So you would say their own action shows this is really key for their own success. So in reality, we should have DI central. Everyone agrees on it. We should have a lot of this in sustainable investment. The reality, however, is that one plus the other equals nothing. And that's the paradox. So again, let's take this again. It's really that we have all the financial institutions, most are offering sustainable investment products today. These same institutions say DI is super important. They have a lot of internal initiative. These institutions all use a lot of aggregated ESG data for their sustainable investment products. They have detailed data on carbon, water, biodiversity. So they understand the importance of data to include in investment strategies. But all of this said, almost none of these institutions are incorporating detailed DEI into their investment strategies. And again, I'm saying detailed DEI and not gender, because diversity, equity, inclusion is much more than gender. Gender is, of course, the most important dimension. And we have seen more institutions starting to look at gender on board levels, but it's really only there. But again, coming back to what is it that makes us unique? What is it that makes us diverse, the cognitive diversity that really creates the innovation, recognize opportunities, but also identifies the risks, like Kodak moments. We don't do that if we all think alike, look alike, and again, we won't see and think alike because we won't see the risks that are coming. But this is where, again, it's just so interesting that everyone agrees this is super crucial. However, really not many institutions are doing anything about it, despite all the efforts here. But it's not only the investment institutions, it's also the regulators where we can see this. There is very little filing requirements around this. We can take SFDR as an example, some of the new EU regulation. Only 2 of the 18 mandatory fields are related to DEI. And again, it's gender pay gap, and it's gender on the board. But there are so many more important aspects and data points of this in order to really understand it. So when I'm speaking to a lot of the financial institutions and asset managers and so forth all around the world, and probably the 2 key things that comes up, and this is the key, is the data challenge. Most say, why aren't we doing this? We actually would like to, but we can't get the data. And it is true that there currently are no standardized DI filing requirements around the world. Again, if we look at financial filing requirements, it took us 130 years to get to the point we have today. And even now we have IFRS, we have local GAAP. Again, we have differences between publicly listed companies, private companies. So even there, we're not perfect, but of course we are much further than we are in sustainable investment or ESG. The E is much more structured. There are much more filing requirements. It's moved really fast. And of course the social aspect will also come. But currently the case is we don't have this standardized filing requirements, and this means that we can't really easily get to the data. And even where there is requirements, so like gender pay gap in some countries is becoming mandatory, those countries do not agree on how to define it, how to calculate it, which again also makes it quite challenging to work with this on a global level. And then finally, we have other legislation like GDPR in Europe that actually prohibits companies to collect some of this DI data on, for example, race, ethnicity, sexuality on their employees. So if they are not allowed to collect it, how can they then report it? So long story short, there is a lot of challenges in the DI data right now. And this is also why we see the data is really all over the board. If you're just looking at what companies are reporting on the right side, we're seeing some insights on from S&P 500, just a few of the DI data points. Again, it really varies what they report. And this really varies across countries as well. So the point here is really that there is a big challenge for sure. However, the good news is the data does exist and it does go far beyond gender. The issue is, and the bad news is, that it's stored in thousands of different locations in different formats. It often is unstructured. So long story short, it's there, it's just not easy. So we can't go to a 10K or to an annual report and get all the stuff we need. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to stop and say, let's not do anything, because the data is there, and we can talk more about that. But before that, I might want to just show some of the data and the type of insight you can actually get if you go through the efforts of actually collecting it and getting it. So what we're seeing here is then companies' average performance in the different regions around the world. In this slide here, it's the total DI. So again, gender, race, ethnicity, disability, all of them grouped together, and how well companies are performing on this. And I highlighted the Nordics because I'm from Denmark and Sweden. We normally think we're the best at most things in the world, but the reality is we isn't. And in this case, we can see the Nordic companies actually comes in second after the general European companies. But the point of this is really the importance of having this type of data, and also on a granular level, and why it's not enough only to look at gender, because from a gender lens, the Nordics are the best. So the companies in the Nordic are leading when looking at number of women in the board, executives, middle management, all employees, gender pay gaps, maternity leaves, all sorts of things that are focusing on the gender aspect. Companies in the Nordics are the leading. It's actually the same from an age perspective, but you can see that Asia moved up big time from an age perspective, and other like North America moved down. So there is a big shifts happening depending on what lens we look at from the social aspect. And again, then race, ethnicity, because that's actually where the leaders from gender and age are the worst performing companies from a race, ethnicity perspective, which is then different from nationality. And again, looking at some of the other DI dimensions, again, the Nordic companies are in the middle. So it really just showcases the data is there, but also the importance of having the granularity and the type of insights you can get once you actually go through the trouble of collecting it, even if it's a little bit bigger. The second challenge, however, that there also is with DI that we don't have it to quite the same extent for environmental data or cyber risk or financials, is the global challenge and how to make things comparable cross-border. Because many things are comparable cross-border, but if we take a data point like race, ethnicity, I would personally not do much for the diversity on that aspect if I joined the board or leadership in a company in Denmark. But if I did in Uganda, I would. So how do you translate that into some sort of meaningful way of comparison? Because if we just said you need to have X amount of Caucasian to meet a certain level, or what is good or bad, or how do you think about this from a scoring perspective? It doesn't work because the context is different for many companies. So one way is to calibrate things to realities. So saying, again, you have a company only in the US, one only in Denmark, 100% Caucasian leadership, the Danish company would have a higher degree of score because they're more calibrated to the Danish population, which is more Caucasian than the US one. Same with men and women, right? Is where some countries actually have 47-53 distribution, some is 49-51, but on average it's around 50-50. And this is why, again, you can calibrate. This is one way to see and make it meaningful, to say how calibrated are you to the reality of the populations where you operate. Of course, you then also have the companies that operate global. You have to account for that as well. So it's really looking at calibrating towards both the HQ country of companies, but also where are their customer base, where are their employees, and that's really where you get a meaningful comparison and can look at these things. And I think that that's really the good news, that if you go through the trouble of standardizing, harmonizing, and linking all of the data, turning it into scores so it's meaningful to compare cross-border, you can start to get some insights that many others are not able to do. And this is, again, where bringing the social aspect to the core of sustainable investment is key. So one is to get a competitive advantage, but more importantly, also to focus on what are the pieces you want to drive. Do you want to drive, again, some of the impact in certain areas? You can do that when you have this insight. You cannot if it's all lumped together in a broad ESG acronym that is skewed towards the environment. What we're seeing here is an example of a portfolio analysis of a global portfolio, where a company wanted to identify their DI risks. So they historically had also not included DI into their investment strategies, but they got funds from a lot of different people. So they had a very diverse representation of the people providing the funds. It was a pension fund. And this is where, so risk for them was where they had invested in the bottom quartile performance companies relative to country or industry. So again, the reason for the bottom quartile is that we do live in a global world. Things are different in different countries, different contexts. So if we set a threshold, or let's say there need to be a minimum of 40% women for us to invest in a company, that would automatically mean that you probably couldn't invest in companies in China or in Japan and help drive the numbers better there, where it is lower than the numbers are in Europe or the US. So this is where the concept of the quartiles are quite interesting, and where we can see that in this case, 18% of their investment were in the bottom quartile from a gender lens, 25 from the industry perspective on gender. Again, race, ethnicity was 16 and 20, disability was 10 and 14. So again, this is where looking at the portfolio is quite an interesting way of seeing where is the risk, where is it not. And this is also where, like, then looking at specific countries, so you could say all the holdings in that portfolio in Japan was actually pretty low. So they weren't really in the bottom quartiles. However, in Germany, they were in the higher ones. So again, why have these structures started evolving in the investment portfolios? Same with certain industries, where some companies, some industries, all the investments were made in the upper, second, or third quartile, but other, they were in the bottom quartile. So it's just, again, an example of how to identify risk within portfolios, but also to consider how to build investment products for the future generations. That is a lot more focused on DI, and the social aspect is something everyone can relate to. Not everyone cares about biodiversity, sadly, but that's the case. But most people are diverse in some way or another, and really care about not having their investments or their savings going to companies that do not perform well in certain areas where they don't like. So similar to, like, today, we in many ESG funds, screen out also tobacco or companies that are producing landmines, things like that. But it's the same thinking that a lot of the new generations are having. I don't want my money if I'm a woman, to go to companies that are not performing well on women, or I want my money to go more as an inclusive investment strategy to companies that are performing well on this. So just one use case example. The other is, of course, around engagement stewardship, as many are doing in sustainable investment. Trying to make an impact, get change into companies. This is also where having some of this data really enables the investment community to look at what are the areas we should focus on, where are companies already overachieving compared to their peers and the industry, where are they lagging behind, and what is realistic targets. So instead of saying to a company that might be in the oil and gas sector where numbers are low, so let's say that it's 15% on women in the executive level, it might be harder for a company in oil and gas to then go from 15 to 40 or to 50 versus a company in hospitality where the average is already 35. So again, setting realistic targets, proving with data why it is we want the companies to move, and that it is possible to move because their peers or the industry might be there. So all in all, that was a lot of talk from me around sort of bringing the social aspect into the core of sustainable investment. As I hope you saw from these two use cases, you can really get some new insights and use that for either limiting risk, attracting more funds, or for, again, some of the impact pieces actually help move the needle in certain areas. So yeah, I guess the key takeaways from me, at least, and happy to take any questions. That is really that in order to bring the social aspect into the core of sustainable investment, we need to break up the ESG acronym and look at them individually. So that's number one. Two, it is really that the DI, the human capital aspect, is literally understood and incorporated by investors and regulators today. But if you go through the troubles of doing it, you actually have new investment insights and better understanding of risk, and you can use that for what purpose you would like. But yeah, it was a pleasure being here. I hope people enjoyed hearing some of these insights. But yeah, open to any questions you might have or any comments, even from you, Glenn. Could be great to hear.
Thank you, Anders. Great talk. Great talk. A lot of interesting points. A lot of takeaways for sure. One word you often hear in this area really is stewardship. One of the last words you used, and I think part of that often starts out as a mindset. And I think a lot of what you talked about and what we see in practice is probably more of a mindset, well-intended, looking to drive that. You had a stat up on one of the slides where when you think about employees, customers, people want to be associated with companies that have these worthy goals as part of their mission, right? As they look through. I think it's important, though, from a data standpoint, like you said, to decouple the letters, right? Because the world, and even some of the SEC's recent proposals on tracking some of the data really does favor the E, because a lot of people track that, or it's more perhaps measurable. But that one slide you had, where you had really the mosaic of the types of things you could look to, I thought was really important, including like safety. You often forget about safety. You had a fatality data point there as well, which is pretty interesting. And for a given industry, that could be incredibly important. The S in the ESG is probably, out of all of them, probably the one that requires probably the deepest look, because it's probably perhaps sometimes the hardest one to quantify. I found it interesting too that you mentioned that you've been finding that it does exist. It's just that it's warehoused or scattered kind of all over the place. What could companies do to kind of maybe put a fence around that, or a big lasso around trying to get some of that data back, maybe in a central location? Any suggestions on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it's a very good point around, again, when it's about mindset, both in terms of wanting to do more on the S, and I think many have wanted, but then haven't really found the means and ways to do it. But this is where it is possible, and I think at the end of the day, it's also the people that is going to take the decisions that's going to save the planet. And on the E, so it is really at the forefront. So more is coming, but it's the same with the mindset when we're talking about how to get more of this data. If your mindset is I'm coming from a background of financial risk and I want it in a 10K, and if something changes, I want it the next second, and the reliability is super high. It's been audited by a lot of big four accounting companies. If that's your mindset, yeah, you're not going to get very far, because we're still on a journey of getting more of that in, and that's maybe where many people have sort of stopped, because they have that mindset. But if your mindset is let's get what out there, and that's where you can start looking at many different areas and sources, and as long as you keep source transparency, that way you actually know where is information coming from, and some sources might not be as reliable, but it's better than zero. But also when you take multiple sources in, you can start doing source triangulations. So this is where you can look at news, you can look at websites, you can look at the filing requirements, you can look at registries, you even look at social media if you want to, even if there you definitely have a reliability problem. However, again, you have enough data from there and you know it's coming from there. It's okay to start thinking about it and see the signals it gives you. So again, combining and using multiple sources, keeping source transparency is one way to do it and to get started, and suddenly you actually have a lot of data that historically wasn't there. But the mindset needs to be there, that you have to be able to accept that it's not coming from the 10K tomorrow, and it's not being updated the second as there has been a change.
How about your experience with companies' CSR reports? Do you find some of the data in those reports, which are obviously currently decoupled from the 10K?
Yeah, so that's another good question. Again, of course, because at Denominator, this is a lot of the work we do every day. So we see it from all the sources. And the good news is, again, not only is the data there, but also the amount of transparency in this area is increasing, especially for large publicly listed companies in their ESG, sustainability, CSR reports. More and more DI elements are being included in it. However, take two reports from two large publicly listed companies in the same country, it would be very different what they put in. So to your point, there is more data there, so that's the good thing. However, there is also, as I mentioned, GDPR is a massive issue. If you only go to those type of reports, you won't get the data in areas like Europe, and you have to go to multiple other sources as well. But at least we're moving in the right direction on those.
Anders, in your work at Dominator, how do you find the tone at the top in organizations on this topic, whether it's the C-suite or the board?
Yeah, no, so I think that's the interesting thing again, and almost back to the investment paradox that I talked about. The tone at the top is super laser focused on DI, because they understand how crucial it is for attracting the right talent. And there is a war on talent right now. There's the big recession as well, or resignation is called. Yeah, maybe also recession at some point. But this is why you need the right people. And again, also when you see how most businesses are actually changing, and they're changing even quicker now, to move to more IP and human capital focus. That's where the value is generated. It's not as much the big machines anymore. So again, talent is even more crucial. So to your question, both the board and the C-levels are super honed in on DI, both for getting the right people, but also because they know the investors are starting to be honed in on this. But is again where that paradox that everyone is honed in on it, but still there is very little effort doing into transparency and this. But the good news is some financial institutions are definitely starting to move the needle big time. Gender is the first, but looking at all the others. So there is going to be a massive push here, and we also see it from the regulators. It is coming. It's just the last sort of step on that risk journey that I talked about in the beginning.
Yeah, sometimes when you think about mindset and wanting to do it versus having to do it. So maybe from a mindset standpoint, in a perfect world, this would become almost a self-regulatory type of transparency and disclosure, and not necessarily be force-fed by some supreme regulator or something like that. And perhaps there might be a better willingness then, because it's more, well, this is what we're about, and we're driven on this, and look, here's how we're doing it. And hopefully that intention then doesn't get, well, we think you need to do more, where you come up with some sort of regulatory kind of gate that people then feel, because then it becomes a box checking exercise, right?
Yeah.
And then you lose kind of that holistic intent that you talked about kind of at the beginning. And I think that becomes an issue as well.
But I think to that point, and you also mentioned it around this, is, you know, people want to work for companies that are doing great things. So it is very important, and I think that's also what companies are realizing. You need to communicate about the good stuff you're doing, and that's why, yeah, it doesn't have to be regulatory driven, because when you have candidates that are just graduating out of a college or a university or just out of school and want to go work, when they have 3 or 4 companies they want to go work at, they do go online, they do research them, they are looking at this. So it is again where it's in every company's interest to be more transparent about this when they're doing good things, and if they do bad things, even tell it, and then say, this is our plan to make it better. People seem to be very receptive of that approach as well.
Yeah, a transparency, a communication that kind of cascades throughout the organization, that all levels of the organization would know what the company is attempting to do in this area. I think that just bodes well for everyone, for sure.
Exactly.
Well, Anders, thank you for joining us today from Columbia for One Sustainability. It's Anders Rodenberg. Terrific presentation today, and we thank you and wish you the best of luck, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for organizing, and doing all the great work. But it was a pleasure, and see you next time, and have a nice day.
Take good care. Thank you.
Bye.